Daniel chapter 11. And we're going to be picking up basically at verse 36, but I'm going to back up. Thank you who were here last week and bore with me through the difficult time through the first verses of chapter 11. And I need to sort of summarize what I closed with last week because it's so critical to this transition then to verse 36. So how I closed last week, we talked about verses 2 through 25. So important to make this transition from verse 35 to 36. I will tell you again, yes, certainly the Jews in the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, this evil ruler from the Greek kingdom and from the Seleucid dynasty within the Greek kingdom, many of those Jews under his reign of terror suffered through fire of trials and tribulations. Many of them died, but again, the Jews as a people, those Jews as a people were eventually delivered from the tyranny of Antiochus, and they moved on. The Jewish rebels ended up having victory over the soldiers of Antiochus. That was likely a God deal. These rebels had no business beating the mighty army. I did it, Dan. I thought I checked it earlier. Thought it was coming through. Is it coming through the microphone? Flick the switch some more. Any luck yet? And you always seem to have trouble with that switch. And so, again, get back on track here. So those Jews struggled, obviously, and they went through trials and tribulations and so forth. But they received victory. And so that time of the end, the coming at the appointed time in verse 35. Look at verse 35 again that we finished with last week. Some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, made spotless until what? The time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. What I'm trying to say here in summary from where we left off last week is, yes, I think that applied some to those Jews who were suffering at that time under Antiochus IV Epiphanes. I think it applies somewhat to them, but I think it's also the key to the transition to the verses we're looking at today. I think, first of all, many translations, but not the NIV, but many translations start out verse 36 with the word then. Meaning all this stuff that we say about, that we read about through verse 35 last week, and then what it says in verse 36, and I think that's a key for help us to understand. Then the king will do as he pleases. All the stuff leading up to verse 35, then we're making a transition, and then after that, at some point, then another king will do as he pleases. I think, again, this ties into the refining and purification of the Jewish people, not just that happened during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, but the continuing refining and purification of the Jewish people that has gone on since then, still goes on today. Again, look at what's going on with Israel and Hamas and all that stuff. That's why I started this sermon series on Daniel, because of questions about that purification, that process that God is working through His chosen nation of Israel continues to go on, and will until the time of the end, when it's to come to an end, at a time God has already appointed and already set. And that time, again, tell me somebody knows, that time of the end, at the appointed time, will be when? When Jesus comes back, at the second coming of Jesus Christ. That is the appointed time of the end. And so when that final period of time leading up to the second coming of Jesus Christ, which Daniel referred to as Daniel didn't refer to it as a tribulation, but he referred to it as the 70th 7-year period that he prophesied. 69 of those 7-year periods have already passed, as we talked about earlier in Daniel. But now, here, this 70th 7 still is coming. And when it comes it will come at the appointed time. And we do know it also as the tribulation. But Daniel especially referred to it as that last of those 77-year periods. And in that time, When that time begins, the king will do as he pleases, as it says in verse 36, as we're going to see. I think the reference to the refining and the purification of the nation of Israel that is mentioned in verse 35, it was happening again in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. It has continued to happen, and it will reach its peak in the final 7-year period, what we refer to as the tribulation period. And it will happen under the little horn, the rule of the little horn, the one who Antiochus Epiphanes pictured or foreshadowed or was a type of. It will happen under, of course, the rule of what we best know as the Antichrist. That will be the time of the end at the appointed time. Those horrible days under that horrible king. So in verse 36, the account in Daniel switches from details that are ancient history to us today. Today, it's ancient history. It happened a long time ago. To details now, it's switching to details that still haven't happened. Remember, when Daniel wrote all the stuff he wrote about that the angel told him in Daniel chapter 11, how much of that stuff had happened when Daniel wrote it? When the angel revealed it all, how much of it had happened? None of it. Today, everything we looked at last week has already happened. What we look at starting this week in verse 36 forward, none of it has happened yet. Track with all of that. It seems very clear that the events of Daniel chapter 12, which we're not going to get to till next week, Lord willing, the events of chapter 12 certainly haven't happened yet. For example, Daniel chapter 12 verse 2 clearly talks about the resurrection of people. We know, and this is like not just like an individual like Jesus raised from the dead. This is talking about resurrections of whole groups of people, both saved and unsaved. We know that hasn't happened yet. Hopefully, we understand that from the Bible. And chapter 12 opens with a phrase, "at that time." So at the beginning of chapter 12, it says, "at that time." At what time? At the time it's being talked about at the end of chapter 11. It's just one continual statement. And I talked about this last week, but I'm restating it because it's so important to understand. Remember, the chapter divisions and the verses were added later. They weren't inspired by God. The original account just continued from the last verse of chapter 11 into the first verse of chapter 12, and there was no division. It says, at that time, at the time that this stuff that was described at the end of chapter 11 that we're going to look at today, at that time, the stuff in chapter 12 goes right along with that. And so the stuff in chapter 12 is future, so too is the stuff, is just continuing the discussion of the verses that we're looking at today at the end of chapter 11, if you can follow along with that reasoning. Careful study also reveals that there are other things in these verses, the last verses in chapter 11 that we're going to look at today. There are other things in there that if you study carefully, you can see they did not apply to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, nor to the events of that day so long ago, the days when he was reigning in terror over Israel. But instead they apply to this future man whom Antiochus foreshadowed, like he was a picture of, this future man who again is who? Will be who? The Antichrist, the little horn of Daniel. And it also looks at this time of wrath that will occur during the final 7-year period, the 70th seven, the tribulation period, the time of Jacob's trouble. And we'll discuss these additional things that chapter 11 talks about here in these verses today. As I hit some of them, I will talk about how they point to the fact that they didn't apply to Antiochus, which everything that last week did. But these things that I point out today in these verses will be more proof that these verses didn't apply to him. They apply to the one that he foreshadowed. They apply to this future world terror leader of the Antichrist. So let's read verse 36. Again, most translations, I would even say, would start with then. Then the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. For what has been determined must take place. So beginning with this verse and continuing over the next 3 verses, we read the initial descriptions of a king. Descriptions that sound, if you read them, and read the verses all together, it sounds very much like an introduction to this new king. That would be very out of place if it referred to Antiochus Epiphanes, who was introduced clear back in verse 21. This is the first thing I'm citing. If you read these verses, these first verses that we're looking at today, 36, 37, 38, these verses sound like an introduction to someone. If it was relative to Antiochus Epiphanes, who we looked at last week, he was introduced clear back in verse 21. It would be very out of place for him to be introduced again in verse 36. And so I would submit to you, this is the introduction of someone different. Someone like Antiochus, only far worse. It's one of the evidences that we see if we study carefully. Nor are there historical facts that match up with these verses that we're going to read today. Remember last week, we showed how history it matches so exactly that people can't believe that anybody actually predicted it, right? That world history shows who fulfilled all the stuff we read about in all those verses last week. These last verses today, you can't pin them to anything in history. It's nothing like it. Again, if you study it carefully, you can see all those verses last week clearly were fulfilled in all those names I threw out at you last week. You know, like Ptolemy the Fourth Philopater and all those kinds of names. You can't find anything in history that matches up with these verses we're looking at today. It's another point that makes our main point that this stuff isn't about Antiochus Epiphanes. This stuff wasn't fulfilled back then. This stuff is something still future today. In Daniel chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Revelation chapters 13 and 17, there's references all in those verses that seem to line up more. Those verses clearly talk about the future leader, this future world leader, the little horn, the Antichrist, and they line up a lot more. Those descriptions line up a lot more with these verses that we're looking at today here at the end of Daniel chapter 11. The world power ruler of the final version of Daniel's fourth beast. Who is that final? What did Daniel see in the vision? That final world ruler who came out of the 10 horns of that fourth beast? The little horn. The little horn that arose among those 10 horns. First uprooted 3 of them, and then the rest of them bowed down to him. And all that stuff was prediction of this one who has not yet come. He will do whatever he wants to do. It says here in verse 36. Of course, that will be within limits set by God. God always sets limits. But he will do what he pleases within those limits. And he will do that until when? He will do that again. What I said in the beginning, got it out of you, pried it out of you. Until Jesus comes back, the second coming, and stops him. That's what this is all about. This guy will oppose everything that is called God or worshipped. He'll oppose every form of religion because he will exalt himself. And he will even set himself up in God's temple, proclaiming to be God. Look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4 in the New Testament. And now listen, here's another contrast. Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, he set up an image in the temple too, right? He set up an abomination that causes desolation, and they butchered a hog in the temple. But you know what the image was that Antiochus set up? History says it was an image of the Greek god Zeus, not of himself. This guy, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4 says he will set up an image of himself. You see the difference? Again, another thing in these verses themselves that say the subject has changed. It will be somebody like Antiochus, but somebody who hasn't come on the scene yet. And when he does, here's the stuff about him. I can't overstate how important it is for you to understand this transition that's being made from verse 35 to verse 36 here in Daniel 11. It makes all of the world of difference in understanding what's going on. Can't overstate that. Finally, verse 36 says that the success of this future king, who Daniel called the little horn, who we know as the Antichrist, we know him much better that way. It will last until when? According to verse 36. Until the time of wrath, what?
It's completed.
Has been completed. What time of wrath? Whose wrath? God's wrath. When will God's wrath be completed?
It comes back.
When Jesus comes back. I know you think I'm going to fall off, but I got it under control. Well, sort of. Not always. The time of God's wrath will be completed at the end of the 70th seven when Jesus Christ returns and completes that wrath. And so the work of this man that's being spoken about in these verses won't be completed until Jesus comes back and completes the wrath of God, which will go on during that final 7-year period. And Jesus completes the wrath of God when he sends Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet into the lake of fire and slays all the unbelievers that are left in the world after the tribulation period. The length of rule of this final and most evil king has already been determined by God. For what has been determined must take place, it says in verse 36. God has already determined this. He has already determined that this will be the time when his wrath will be poured out on the earth. And it must happen. He said it would happen. It will happen. All people who are alive on the earth when that terrible 7-year period begins will experience the awful judgment of the wrath of God. The prophet Zephaniah wrote, "The great day of the Lord is near. That day will be a day of wrath, distress, trouble, ruin, darkness, gloom. The Lord declares that he has decided to assemble the nations, to gather the kingdoms, and to pour out his wrath on them. All his fierce anger, and the whole world will be consumed." End quote. That's taken from Zephaniah chapter 1 and chapter 3, portions of each. But Daniel's people, who? Israel, will be especially targeted during that time. Zephaniah also wrote this, quote, "Gather together, O shameful nation," singular, referring to Israel, "before the appointed time arrives, and that day sweeps on like chaff before the fierce anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's wrath comes upon you." You who? The nation of Israel. Seek the Lord, you who do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. That's taken from Zephaniah chapter 2. In this future time when God pours out his wrath on earth, and then the book of Revelation has many of the details about what that will involve. And when God pours his wrath out specifically upon the nation of Israel, for again, this time is referred to by Jeremiah as the time of Jacob's trouble, or the time of Israel's trouble. When God does that, he will pour out his own judgments, and he will also allow the Antichrist to do many horrible, awful things. But again, only within the limits that God has set for the little horn, and only for the fixed amount of time that God has set. Only for that 7-year period. And especially the second 3.5 years, the second half of it, the 3.5 years, the second 3.5 years will be the worst. When that time is up, then the end that is decreed will be poured out on who? The little horn, the Antichrist. Stay with me here, man. Stay with me, people. Daniel 9:27. For in the end, when the time is fulfilled, what is decreed will be poured out upon him. Speaking of the Antichrist, the little horn. Also compare, what verse 35 talks about that we looked at the end of last week. The time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. It ties into that as well. Verse 37. I need to move. He will show no regard. Who? Who's he? The Antichrist, or the little horn from Daniel. We're in Daniel, and Daniel referred to him as the little horn. And so I like to really always try to refer to him as that too. The little horn will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors, or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. And so quickly, Antichrist will follow none of the pagan practices of his ancestors. which is another reason why this cannot refer to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. I already talked about what did Antiochus IV Epiphanes have set up in the Jewish temple that profaned it? An image of the Greek god Zeus. And there's lots of extra biblical, outside the Bible evidence that Antiochus IV, he faithfully worshiped Greek gods. That will not be the case with this guy that Antiochus was a type of or a foreshadowing of. The little horn, the Antichrist, he will not worship any of the gods that his ancestors followed. He won't worship any kind of a god. He wants what? He wants himself to be worshipped. That's what he will desire. And that's what he will seek to have people do. The one desired by women here has been talked about by many. I think, without spending too much time on it, I think it's likely a reference to the Messiah. He's talking about he won't, this little horn, this future world ruler, he won't worship any of the pagan idols or gods of his ancestors, nor will he worship the one desired by women. And many think that many Jewish women longed to end up being the mother of the Messiah. So the one desired by women would be the one that Jewish women desired to be the one that would be able to give birth to. I think it's a reference. It's saying he didn't worship any of the pagan gods of his ancestors, nor did he worship the only true God. Jesus, through Jesus Christ, now we know to be through the one desired by women would be the one, again, born of Mary. Instead of worshiping any of the pagan gods or the one true God, the little horn will set himself up as the object of worship. I noted that before in my comments last week and even this week again on verse 36, including the New Testament passages that cite that as well. A quick side note, some folks find reason in this verse 37, to believe that Antichrist will be Jewish. I am baffled by that. It completely baffles me. And I would ask, do any of you, would you know why? Why it would baffle me so badly why anybody would think that the Antichrist could be Jewish? Yeah, I've talked time after time after time through the book of Daniel about what Jesus said about the times of the Gentiles. About these Gentile kingdoms that Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel had divisions about and so forth. It was all about Gentile dominion over Israel. World power, but especially over and oppressing Israel. Up to and including the final one, the little horn, the Antichrist, who will be a world power, who will especially oppress Israel. It's about the times of the Gentiles will be concluded with this final world ruler. He will be the last of the Gentile world rulers who oppress Israel. How could the Antichrist end up being a Jew? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. I guess you could say, well, a Jew could deny Judaism or deny any association with Jews or whatever, but it's, again, if you are Jew ethnically, you're a Jew ethnically, and it just, none of it makes sense. I do not understand how somebody could feel that the Antichrist would be a Jewish, but there are those who do believe that. Oh man, I'm behind. Verses 38 and 39. 38 and 39. Instead of any of the other gods, including the one true God, instead of them, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God unknown to his ancestors. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign God, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price. I got to sum this up quickly, because I'm really running out of time, as usual. Instead of honoring the pagan gods, instead of honoring the true God of the Bible, Antichrist will honor the God of military strength, the God of power. German theologian Karl Kyle, who lived in the 1800s, put it this way: the God of fortresses is a personification of warfare. And the thought is this, that the little horn predicted by Daniel will regard no other God but only war. And he will worship this God above all as a means of him gaining the world power that he craves. End quote. Ultimately, regardless of how much he realizes what's going on, the little horn, the Antichrist, will worship the one who gives him his power, which the book of Revelation says will be
The devil.
Satan, yes. Satan, it says. Revelation 13:2 says that the dragon, Satan, will give the beast, the little horn, the Antichrist, his power. And Revelation 13:4 says that the people will worship the dragon, Satan, in the tribulation period because they will realize that he has given authority to the beast, the Antichrist. And that they will also worship the beast himself. They will say, who is like the beast? Who can make war against him? End quote from Revelation. So I think there's a double meaning going on here. Antichrist will worship military strength and in his own power, but since both of them will be given to him by Satan, he will in reality be worshiping Satan himself as a god. No, how much he realizes it or whatever, can't know for sure, but it's a double meaning here, a layered meaning in this. Antichrist, empowered and helped by Satan, will become a world power conqueror like none ever before him. He will pour a vast amount of wealth that he receives into his efforts to conquer and control other parts of the world. He will give honor and positions of leadership and land to those who follow and obey him and help him. But as with any of the pleasures of evil, his successes, his wealth, his power will be short-lived. Verses 40 through 45. Last verses in the chapter here, 40 through 45. And you got to try to stay with me here. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in a battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. Remember all the talk about the kings of the south and the kings of the north last week, right? Now remember though, this is talking about a future time, but it's using the same imagery. Try to keep that in mind. This is not easy. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and the Cushites in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Let me try to wrap this up for you, but don't get excited. It'll take me a bit here, but try to track with me. This is not easy. Try to track with me. First, these things will happen. It says when. At the time of the end. That's a reference to the conclusion of the 70th seven, the conclusion of the tribulation period. As I noted earlier, the time of the desecration of the Jewish temple and the domination by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, that time was designated by God for a certain amount of time. Before the end of those events and the end of that man, Antiochus, which was decreed by God, yeah, that part of verse 35 applied to that. But now I also believe verse 35 predicts even bigger events, that the events in the days of Antiochus IV Epiphanes only foreshadowed. And that would be, again, Daniel's 70th seven, and the actions of a future world ruler. Again, who? The little horn, the Antichrist. And it will only last for a designated amount of time before the end that has already been decreed by God, as we've talked about. These yet to happen events and this yet to happen evil ruler will both, one more time, again, end with the second coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. That will be the appointed time that period will end. The Lord Jesus Christ, who remembers how the Lord Jesus Christ was depicted in Nebuchadnezzar's vision clear back in chapter 2. By that stone or rock that did what?
Took out the statue.
That hit the statue that King Nebi dreamed about and crushed the feet, iron mixed with clay, and brought the entire statue come tumbling down. And it's also Daniel chapter 7 that Jesus was also pictured in another way. Daniel had the vision, and somebody came before the Ancient of Days. And who was it?
Jesus.
The Son of Man. The Son of Man is the title. And the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel saw this vision and saw the Son of Man coming before the Ancient of Days, representing God the Father on the throne. And the Son of Man, God the Father, He gave Him the authority to destroy and reign and take the power of all these Gentile nations and so forth. that will all again be fulfilled when he returns. See how this stuff all ties together? We need to remember that the beginning of the 70th seven, at the very beginning of it, what will the little horn, the Antichrist, what will he do in regard to Israel at the beginning of the 70th seven? He will make a covenant with them. He will make an agreement with them. It will likely be a peace treaty. It will likely be an agreement that he will protect. He will give peace to Israel. He'll make this 7-year agreement. At the beginning of that time, again, that's Daniel 9:27. We saw that about the times and a half time. But then halfway through that, he would break the covenant. That's what we're setting the stage for again here. As in all the situations we saw in chapter 11 that already happened last week, in verses 2 through 35, here in verses 40 through 45, these last verses of the chapter, the angel said that in a more distant future, at the time of the end, a king of the south and a king of the north will be involved in war. And again, who will be in the middle of it? The nation of Israel. The beautiful land. The beautiful land reference that we read about here in these verses, that's a reference to Israel. It will be right in the middle of it. Now, here's where you got to stay with me, especially. Some people believe that these verses, when it says about the king of the south and the king of the north, they say that they won't be fighting each other, but instead both will be fighting against the Antichrist. And that both of those kings of those nations and their armies will be attacking Israel. That's what many have held. But there are others, and I'm in the others category, who believe that the little horn, the Antichrist, is the king of the north, will be the king of the north. He is the king of the north described here that the angel told Daniel about. He will respond to the king of the south who will be attacking Israel, much like the ones we looked at last week. The kings of the south attacked Israel, and the king of the north, Antiochus, he came down to respond to it. I think the imagery of that, is carried over into this, and I believe that the king of the north will be none other than the one who was foreshadowed by the king of the north that we looked at last week at the very end, who was Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. I and others believe that's what this is saying. And that king of the north will respond to the king of the south's attack against Israel. He'll not only drive out the forces of the king of the south from Israel, but that's when we would believe that he will break his covenant with Israel and he will actually dominate it. He will take it over. The tables will turn and he will go back on his covenant with them. And then he'll proceed from there and he'll go the rest of the way south, down to Egypt and to the other surrounding countries around Egypt. And he will conquer them down there. He'll defeat other countries in his path on the way down there, and he will conquer Egypt. He will loot their wealth. He'll bring neighboring nations under control. And I really, again, believe that scenario fits the picture or the type set by the historical events involving Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes much, much better. I think that imagery lines up so much better. But I have to acknowledge there are a number of solid theologians who believe otherwise. They think that the Antichrist is separate from these fights, that the north and the south are both fighting the Antichrist. And I and others don't think that it lines up with the imagery. I will tell you quickly. Also, some Bible translations actually reflect this second understanding of these verses that I gave you, that I and others believe. Some Bible translations, they actually translate the wording to line up with what I'm saying, what I and others believe. Some Bible translations. It all revolves around, and I'll just tell you this quickly, it's in the sermon notes, you can get them online. I could spend a long time talking about this, and some of you I'm sure don't even want to hear it because it involves grammar, but it all revolves around the understanding of the identification of the second him, H-I-M, in verse 40. The second time him, H-I-M, is used in verse 40, it's either the little horn is in view, if you hold the first view, or that second hymn represents the king of the south. the second view, which is the one that I support. And I think then there's something in grammar called the antecedent. The antecedent is a subject that determines the meaning of a pronoun that follows it. I'm not going to go into this very much, but this is part of my reasoning, whether you like it or not. And I'm not that I love grammar, but this is how I would understand it. That it seems to me that the antecedent that determines the first hymn, H-I-M, in verse 40, is clearly the little horn, but that the second hymn, the antecedent, is the king of the south. The closest subject prior to the second hymn is the king of the south. That's what an antecedent is. And so then the antecedent for the remaining references to he or him, those pronouns, and the rest of these verses are all the king of the north. It would be, again, the little horn. And so that's all I'm going to explain about it, because, again, I'm out of time, but this stuff's in my notes, and I'll be glad to try to flesh this out a little bit more to anybody that's interested, in some other time. The historical South that we saw earlier in chapter 11, the South, the kings of the South centered around what nation? What nation in the south? To the south of Jerusalem? Egypt. Egypt was the historical kingdom in the south in the verses that we looked at, all those verses in chapter 11 that we looked at last week. Egypt is specifically mentioned twice in these verses, along with, of course, the Libyans and the Nubians. And then there's some other specifically named nations that these verses say will be protected from the Antichrist. It doesn't say why or how or anything, but it just says that they will be. The names of the nations in accounts like this, listen to me. When nations are named in these accounts written in an ancient culture, they were the names of the nations at the time it was written. They may not be the names of the nations now. And certainly they may not be the names of the nation by the time the Antichrist and the little horn is on the scene. Many things we can reasonably figure out and say, looks like Egypt is a pretty good guess for this nation. Egypt and actually all the other Arab nations around Egypt right now. If you look at what's going on in the world right now, the Arab nations they hate who? Israel. And they hate anybody, of course, that supports Israel, and which is often why they hate the United States, although, our support is wavering back and forth and so forth. And so, but again, these Egypt and the other Arab nations around them very easily could be, with what we know today, these nations to the south that would be trying to destroy Israel. But you can't know for sure. The names that are listed in the account was what these places were called clear back in, whenever Daniel, the angel first revealed this to Daniel. It was around 175 BC or whatever. Skip over some of that. I think we need to be careful about, again, identifying future nations, what nations they will be. I think it mentions here that the Antichrist will, the little horn will hear about trouble in the what? In the east and in the north. And so then that'll get him all stirred up. And what the sources of those troubles will be, it's been popular for a long time. For a long time, many theologians have declared that they know who the sources of the trouble will be, and to the east it will be China, and to the north, Russia. That you can read that in a lot of older commentaries and so forth. You've got to really be careful making statements like that. We don't know. It could just, I'll tell you what's the nation today to the east of Israel who says they want that Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth? Iran. The nation in the east could easily end up being Iran. And the nation of Turkey is immediately north of Israel, and a large area, a lot of potential for problems and so forth. It could just as easily be them that would be stirring up trouble to the north of Israel. We just don't know for sure who it will be. You know who will know? God. But he knows now. Who will know? Eventually. Well, we will eventually, but what people on the earth will know eventually? the city of Babylon, which many of us think Revelation says will be rebuilt during the tribulation, what country today is Babylon located in? The city doesn't exist, but where it was? Iraq. Guess what's between Iran and Israel? Iraq. And if Babylon is rebuilt and is the center of the Antichrist operations in the tribulation period, and Iran comes against that, that could be the problem that stirs the problem from the east that stirs the Antichrist up. That his center of operation in a rebuilt Babylon in now, today, Iraq, Iran could invade and get, and the Antichrist, he's down south in the Egypt area, wiping up on people down there, and he hears about that, and he's torqued, and he heads for Babylon. Could easily be something like that. The people that are on the earth then will know that. They will know if what is today Iran makes a move on into what is today Iraq and attacks a city that maybe doesn't even exist right now. The people that are on the earth then will know that. You follow me? If they read the book of Daniel then, they will understand. They will say, this is happening. This problem from the east, that's turned out to be Iran. They will know it. Just like Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, that the people would know, the people that were on the earth, and especially the Jews that were in Jerusalem at the time the abomination of desolation happened, they would know what was happening because it would be fulfilled in their eyes. But nobody might know it until it's happening then. But the people that see it then will know it. And Jesus said, when you see it, run. Right? All that, you see how all this ties together, and how Scripture can actually end up, someday, people will dig out copies of the Bible and read some of this stuff when these things are going on and see, it was predicted, this is now. This is, oh my, this is happening now. We're in this. That's going to happen. You follow me? That's going to happen someday. There will still be plenty of Bibles laying around on the earth. Many of them will be in houses of people that think they're going to heaven and won't be raptured off the earth because they're not saved by faith in Jesus. And there'll be lots of Bibles, and this stuff will start going on, and people are going to start reading in their Bibles, and they're going to start finding some of this stuff, and they're going to say, oh my word, you can see it. This is what's happening. We're in this time. And then they're going to get a hold of people, come look at this stuff, and this is what's happening now. What's the rest of it say? What's going to end up happening here? And that's the way it's going to happen someday. Isn't that amazing even just to think about? Isn't it amazing to think about, wondering if what's, again, happening now between Israel and Hamas could be the beginning of some of this stuff? The fact that we can't tie down the exact details in verses 36 through 45 helps to emphasize the understanding that these events haven't happened yet. Although many people will tell you that they have. Many people will tell you that this stuff has already happened. Again, we can now look at history and clearly see how chapter 11, verses 2 through 35 that we looked at last week were literally fulfilled exactly the way God gave to the angel to tell Daniel. Exactly. You saw it last week if you were here or if you watched the recording. We cannot see fulfillment of verses 36 through 45 that we've looked at today. We can't see that in history right now. But we can know that someday, in the future, people will be able to see how the events in verses 36 through 45 were fulfilled literally and exactly the way God said it would happen. That was part of the wonder of last week, is we can see that now. Like how exactly God gave the information to God gave the information to the angel who gave it to Daniel, and how exactly it was fulfilled. We saw that last week in the sermon. I know it was a bear of a sermon, but that was the point of all that. But now these verses, this stuff, we can't see it in history. But someday people will see it. Someday the people, when it's happening, will even see it. And someday after that, people who will read it say, yeah, all that stuff that just happened, that's what this was. That's what Daniel prophesied. That's what the angel told Daniel. So the little horn, the Antichrist, who will eventually set up headquarters, it says, between the seas, right? You know what seas that Most likely is. Between the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. And it will be in the vicinity of the Holy Mountain, most likely referring to the Temple Mount, the location where the temple had always stood. Right now, the Muslim Dome of the Rock is there. By the time this stuff is happening, that will be gone, and there will be some other version of the Jewish temple there. And in that, close to that site, Antichrist will set up headquarters. And the angel then simply told Daniel that the little horn will then come to his end. Not much detail, just said there, he will come to his end. And there will be no one who will be able to help him avoid his demise. Not even Satan, who will have been empowering him, will be able to save the Antichrist. Satan won't even be able to save himself. The book of Revelation gives us a lot more details about these events at the end of the 70th seven. It'll reach the climax when the Antichrist and his armies, along with the leaders and the armies of other nations of the world, will all be gathered where? In the region of Megiddo, near Jerusalem, where the most famous name for, some think it's not just one battle, but a series of battles in Revelation, Armageddon. It comes taken out of the word for Megiddo, the region, the valley where this stuff, all these armies and leaders and so forth will be gathered into that area, including Antichrist, and what will happen? Jesus will come back and put an end to it. Revelation 16:16 is where it talks about Armageddon, but you know Revelation 19. It talks about the rider on the white horse, who is none other than the Lord Jesus Christ. And then from verse 19 on it says, "Then I saw the beast," that would be the Antichrist, the little horn, "and I saw the kings of the earth and their armies gathered to make war against the rider on the horse, Jesus Christ, at his second coming, and make war against his army, who will be legions of angels and multitudes of us who had placed saving faith in Jesus. We have been resurrected to our glorified bodies, and we will ride with him. We will come with him when he returns, but we ain't going to have to do any fighting. You know why? Because what Revelation 19 says, with the sword that comes out of his mouth, with a spoken word, he will strike them all down. That's all it'll take. We'll be support troops, but it'll just be for moral support. Praise God. The beast, it says, will be captured and thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. Again, the beast is Revelation's term for the Antichrist, or the little horn. He'll be thrown alive into the fire lake of burning sulfur. And then it says the rest of them, which will probably be all the unbelieving kings and armies who are gathered in the valley of Megiddo, all who were gathered to make war against Jesus, were killed with the sword that came out of the mouth of the rider on the horse. And yes, that does not fit today's version of Jesus very well, as I've said many times. But the verse is clear there that all those kings and soldiers and the Antichrist and so forth, they will all be killed simply by Jesus speaking the word. And then the other judgments that Jesus described himself in Matthew chapters 24 and 25, like the sheep and the goat judgment and all that kind of stuff, he will finish judging the rest of the people who have survived the tribulation. That's the real Jesus. That's the Jesus of the Bible. The Jesus who loved enough to forever change himself and take on a human body and die to pay the price for sins of those who would believe, but also the Jesus of justice, the Jesus, the Son of God, to whom the Father has given all authority to judge, and who will execute all these judgments in the time of the wrath of God. If you're saved by faith in Jesus, aren't you glad? Aren't you glad that you're on Jesus' side? And I was going to read the words to the final hymn, but I'm over time as usual, and so I won't do that. But the final hymn is Jesus Never Fails. I'm glad I'm on Jesus' side.